Today, I'm going to talk about why some women are attracted to bad boys. Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. So, don't mind my snake, Aristotle. He's a superdwarf reticulated python, if you're not familiar. So, retics are some of the biggest snakes in the world, but there are, from islands, dwarf versions of them, and so he's got a lot of that. So he'll get a few feet longer, but not by a lot, and a bit heavier, but not by a lot. Anyway, he wanted to come out, and I thought, actually, you know what? He's kind of thematically appropriate, because retics have something of a reputation. It's kind of fading, but something of a reputation for being bad boys in the snake world. They're constrictors, by the way, for those who don't know. Most snakes are not venomous, and they kill by constricting their prey. Reticulated pythons, they're very active snakes. They're very intelligent snakes. And so, especially when a lot of them were wild caught, they were, used to surviving in the jungles of East Asia. And, it's not a safe place. And so they're often kind of aggressive. And because they're very active, plus being aggressive, they got kind of a reputation for that. But the thing is, the same thing that makes them, that made the wild-caught ones who, had actually generally gone through the skin trade, they were going to be killed, but then they, so they're treated very badly by people. So they had a lot of bad experiences with people, and then they showed up, having grown up in the jungles where a lot of things want to eat you, and having to fight for every meal and so on. The same things that made them very difficult for people to deal with, being big and strong and intelligent and active and so on, also make them great pets if you raise them from when they're hatchlings. Now, this is not a video about snakes, this is a video about bad boys, but it actually works really well. The same things that make them, or that made them the original bad boys, make them really great pets because they're very interesting to interact with. When you raise them so they don't have lots of bad experiences and they learn that people are actually perfectly safe, then, they're actually really, really great pets. They're not dangerous at all. And so that same kind of phenomenon actually explains the whole bad boy phenomenon. So there's a distinction we have to draw. Some people will be familiar with this, some people not, between natural virtues and moral virtues. Moral virtues are things like faith, hope, love, courage, temperance, prudence, and so on. Whereas the natural virtues are things like intelligence and beauty and strength, and you can even include wealth in that, actually. They are the things that on a natural level give you the ability to do things. The moral virtues are whether you use your natural virtues well or badly. Wants to climb some of the plants I have in my office. Now, this bears very, very directly on bad boys, because the thing that you want... look at this from the perspective of a woman, right? What you want in a husband is somebody who has both moral and natural virtues. You want somebody who is strong and beautiful, healthy, intelligent, etc., in varying amounts. You don't need these things to be maximal by any means, but they need to be present. You need to be able to do useful things. You need to have these things to pass on to your children. You need to be healthy enough to be around and so on, etc., etc. You also need the moral virtues, things like courage, for example, the willingness to use strength even when it might be scary to do so. So we come to a real problem. It's fairly straightforward to assess whether or not a person has natural virtues. There are some details about trickery and stuff, but to a great degree, you can tell when a person has natural virtues, a lot of them just by looking. Is a person healthy? Yeah, there's some details, but for the most part, we're actually pretty good at picking up on the physical signs of illness or significant deformity or so on. So, can people stand upright? Can they walk reasonably? A lot of things are going right with them if they can do even those things. Do they cough all the time, or, can they actually speak normally? Are they reasonably symmetric, etc.? Which speaks to a lot of how they developed. And, you can tell, how big are the various proportions of their body? Are they, unable to pick up an empty paper bag, or are they, reasonably able to help you? Do you think they'd be able to hold up a child and open a door at the same time, etc.? These things we're really good at telling about a person with a fair degree of accuracy, just by looking, just by interacting with them a little bit, and so on. The moral virtues, by contrast, are really hard to tell about a person, because the thing about most moral virtues is they only apply when things are real. So you cannot have a test of courage. The problem with a test of courage, in a true and real sense, is that courage is doing what you should even though there is danger. If there is nothing at stake and the thing is dangerous, you should not do it. It's not courageous to go and leap across a pit of flaming alligators just in order to show a person that you don't mind leaping across a pit of flaming alligators. That's stupid. That's taking a risk with absolutely no benefit to it. And so this is just a violation of the virtue of prudence. Now, there may be some special circumstances in which, maybe, but the problem is, even this test, there is something very much on the line that is going to be of benefit to the person who is doing the test. And that's very different than a person who would be willing to leap across a pit of flaming alligators. The alligators themselves are spewing fire out somehow within this hypothetical. We just need it to be nice and extreme and dangerous. The person who will leap across a pit of flaming alligators because there is a child who's in danger of falling in on the other side and you just need to help them. And nobody will ever know. And see, that's one of the things. The real virtue of courage comes in when you're going to take this major risk to yourself and leaping across and saving the child who's crawling into the pit of flaming alligators, but no one would ever know you could have done it. There aren't witnesses around to witness to it. So it was somebody else's responsibility to watch the child. If something happens, they'll be blamed, not you. That's when the virtue of courage really comes in, when there isn't a benefit to you, when you are relied upon to do something for somebody else that's dangerous to you just because it's the right thing to do. Well, you can't manufacture that circumstance, not morally. You can't intentionally put a child next to a pit of flaming alligators to see if somebody else will save him. That is being irresponsible to the child. So the problem, now I'm using a little bit of an extreme example, and it's, I'm being a little silly for the sake of humor, but this does apply to all, to much, much more, mundane, realistic things. Is a person willing to undergo the drudgery of work in order to provide a reasonable living to his children for years on end? Good luck devising an experiment to find that one out. Now, the problem with the modern world is that a lot of dating and so on happens before people would do anything that might give you even a decent idea of this. So go back to how things used to be several hundred years ago. So before the Industrial Revolution, when people, when something like 80% of the population of the world were farmers, maybe higher than that, maybe 90%. But whatever it was, you tended as a young man would tend to apprentice to, his father or his, near relatives at a fairly young age. Going with the common one of farmer. It's true of other things too, but going with the common one of farmer, you would start working on the farm. Little kids would do useful chores that, might be something simple and easy, like feeding some chickens or whatever. But, as you start to get to being a teen, as you're starting to get to the age of hitting puberty, a young man would be going out and doing the drudgery of farm work. You would be, not necessarily doing the same thing, but you might be spending an entire day driving oxen, or you might be tending sheep, or you might be, going out and picking rocks out of the field so they don't break your plow as you're plowing through the ground, or, any number of other things that aren't fun, that are just difficult, but, doable, very doable. They're just, they're hard work. They're not pleasant. They're not fun. No one would ever do it for entertainment, but there's a value to you and your family for it. And you go out and do it day after day after day after day. And the thing is, by the time a man would be of marriageable age, he would have been doing this for a whole bunch of years. So, does this prove what he will be like as an independent adult? No, but it gives you a much better idea, because there's often at least some reasonable social element to it, and over time people would have a sense of like how much of a worker is the person actually. If a person was apprenticing, his father's a carpenter, he's working in the carpenter shop. Well, he'll be doing some of the work. There'll be a sense, from other carpenters who stop by to see, as people see the work that's made and so on. There'll be a sense of like, is this person actually doing his work? Does he, work? So that by the time he's of actually marriageable age, assuming that he's of marriageable age, let's call it 18, you have like 6 years of him doing some reasonable amount of work in his father's shop, or doing a reasonable amount of work in his father's fields, or what have you. And so you would have something to base your idea of how much is this person, does he have the, minimum moral virtues to be a reasonably functional member of society. As distinct from a person who spends all his time partying. People constantly see him not in the fields when all the other people are in the fields. They see him showing up, having fun, doing other things all the time. Well, that kind of gets around as well. And, in a lot of cases, a young woman would only have so much of a say in who it was she married, and her family would have a bunch of a say too. And, and that had its own, I'm not, by the way, trying to lionize that. It had its own things where families definitely considered who their daughters would marry with an eye towards the benefit to the family, not, entirely with an eye to the benefit of the daughter, or, even more so what it really should be, the benefit of their grandchildren. Fallen humans are fallen humans, and whatever societal organization you have, they're going to do bad things within it. An awful lot of them will. And so the point, though, is that whether it's the young woman or whether it's her family, varies with the particular time period and the particular culture. There are, thousands of distinct cultures, around the world over time. And, it's not the same thing whether you're in Transylvania, whether you're in Africa, or whether you're in France, or whether you're in Australia, or Japan, or South America, specific parts of South America, because there are lots of different cultures there, etc. So, these things over time have all been different, etc. But, painting with a broad brush, somebody is evaluating the potential children. And whether it's the woman or whether it's, her parents, you have stuff to go by as to what is this person like by the time they're of seriously marriageable age. Now, some of this doesn't apply in the nobility, because, a person's property becomes so fixed. A person's labor in the nobility is only one fraction of what they bring to a marriage. Their straight up property would be proportionally much larger amongst the nobility. And so, even if the first son of a count was not all that great, well, he still is the one who inherits. And so, the considerations would be different. And because a lot of historical fiction is utterly fascinated with nobility or whatever, even in places where there isn't an aristocracy, there's something analogous most of the time. For the simple reason that until recently, being a good warrior was one of the most useful things in society, prior to the development of guns. And being a good warrior tended to rely on highly heritable traits, such as being bigger, having a propensity to develop muscle, in response to exercise, being of above average intelligence. Like, intelligence is only semi-heritable, but above average intelligence tends to produce above average intelligence. Geniuses rarely have genius parents, and geniuses rarely have genius children. But above average intelligence tends to result in above average intelligence, which that's all you really need to be a good fighter. You don't need to be a genius to be a good fighter, but intelligence really helps in fighting. And then, so the various things that in a pre-gun society make you a good warrior are highly heritable traits, and hence everybody had some sort of heritable system where you tend to have some version of the people who are, big and strong and good at fighting. You feed them a lot and they protect you. Again, painting with a very broad brush. Anyway, these are the people who, because of that, and because people would sort of trade taking care of them in various fashions, the ones probably most of my viewers will be familiar with will be the feudal type systems of Europe and Japan. But like literature has been very, very preoccupied with them because they're interesting. I mean, they have more things. They lead an interesting life, etc., especially in fiction. And a lot of people would much rather be a duke than a farmer. But there are far, far, far more farmers. Farmers were much, much more of humanity, and much more of how life went. And the thing is, when you're looking at human happiness, people assume that the dukes must have been really happy, but they were tools to the peasants, as much as they had a higher social status than the peasants. But at the same time, these are the people who, if bandits are coming, they're the people who are responsible to put on the armor and grab their weapons and go out and put themselves in danger to keep you, the peasant, safe. So, when armies are marching and so on, peasants might have to serve in armies some of the time, but it is the lords who go out in front. They're the ones in the armor, and they're the ones who have to take care. So, and a lot of their life was built around training them to be really good at doing things like fighting. So how great a life did they have? It's actually a lot more debatable than people realize. Anyway, the bearing of this stuff on bad boys, because this is not a huge tangent actually, is that all of these things, the nobility a little bit less, but the nobility had its own ways of demonstrating the valor of people even before combat. That's why knights would take part in all sorts of jousts and battles. And, the things they did weren't super safe. Like jousting, and jousting is a bit late, especially in the form we know, where people had 60-pound suits of armor and rode on war horses at high speed. But something that's not understood very well about that is you collide with somebody else, each of you going 30, 35 miles an hour, you're doing the equivalent of slamming into something at 60 to 70 miles an hour. It's really easy to die that way, even if you have a 60-pound suit of armor and a wooden lance that can break. Getting knocked off your horse when you and the other guy are going at these speeds, the impacts are unbelievable. So, so they would take part in things that weren't very optional and were kind of dangerous, which at least did some amount, though they were morally questionable, did some amount, and they were kind of circumscribed, of proving how tough you were. And the other thing, too, slight digression, but also very useful, because we'll see this come up in the bad boy example. For much of the medieval period in Europe, you had things like carriages were for women. Like a box that protects you from the rain and stuff. If you're a lord, you should be on your horse. Why are you bothered by the weather? You're going to have to fight in any weather. Your life is about being able to fight all day in the hot sun. You're just sitting on a horse as you walk along. What the heck do you need to sit down on a chair for? The extra effort involved of being on a horse, the extra, inconvenience of being out in the sun and the rain or whatever. If this bothers you, something is deeply, deeply wrong with you. You need to man up. Well, that sort of thing, again, by having these really tough standards, they help to show from a young age that a person, never complains about these tough standards, that you never catch, Baron so-and-so in a carriage, he's always on his horse. This, this teaches you something about him, that he definitely has a bunch of the toughness to withstand, at least these simple things. It's still nothing compared to putting on armor and getting on a battlefield where somebody wants to kill you and is going to try very hard to kill you. But, it gives you something of at least a preview of how a person is likely to do. In our modern world, trying to assess those moral virtues of things like courage and fortitude and temperance and so on, well, look at the modern world. Men, if you go to college, men aren't doing anything to show much of any moral virtue until they're in their early 20s. Then finally you start, actually getting a job. But until, like, and that's assuming you don't go to grad school. If a man goes to grad school, it's even worse. Now, most people don't go to grad school, so I'm not going to worry about the higher education stuff. But if you look at it, like, throughout high school, well, I mean, anybody can show up to high school. I mean, the cops literally will make you until your senior year, and, no one actually cares how good your grades are. So, like, what the heck do you have to show that anybody has any moral virtue through high school? They're not doing anything that tests any moral virtues. They're not, a complete psycho. They're not, utterly crazy, but, that's not worth very much. Statistically, 99% of people aren't complete, more than 99% of people aren't complete psychos. So you can just kind of assume that and be mostly right about people. So especially in high school, then, through college, if people go to college, and like 50% of the population of the United States goes to at least some college, like 30% graduates. And, again, like, you're not doing very much. Now, the whole bad boy phenomenon, if you look at it, is almost invariably about young women. These two things are related. Because young women, when they look at young men, aren't seeing them do anything that requires much of any moral virtue. Now, what do bad boys do? Now, the bad boys who are attractive to women, because, like, we're not talking about men who run, teenagers who run Ponzi schemes, right? I mean, they're bad, but, that's they never attract women. We're not talking about... we're not talking about people who are involved in botnet hacking networks in order to encrypt people's hard drives and demand Bitcoin ransoms. These aren't the guys who get girls, the bad guys. They're bad, but they're not the bad boys that attract women. It's not any vice that attracts women. If you look at what they are, and by the way, I really recommend Taylor Swift had a song called Trouble, which is a fine song if you like that kind of thing, but the music video that went with it is really, really fascinating. Because one of the things that it really portrays is the bad boy that she was attracted to and who eventually left her. It's really, really good at portraying how the particular vices that he had are things that can be easily mistaken for virtues until you push them far enough. Now, here's where we come to, young women often don't know much about young men, just as young men often don't know much about young women. Adult men know more about women, and adult women know more about men. But when you're talking about teenage boys and teenage girls, they're often surprisingly ignorant of each other. And even as you start pushing it, these days, like even people, if they go to college and just push that into their 20s, it's interesting how little they often know about each other, and so they're not so good at recognizing. Males and females are a lot more similar than a lot of people give credit to. They're also in certain ways more different than people give credit to. In fallen world, people make both kinds of mistakes. But in that kind of environment, when you don't know the particular expressions of virtues and vices, it's especially easy to mistake virtues and vices for virtues in the other sex when you don't really know much of anything about them. There actually are some similar things that happen where men mistake things about young women, but that they're kind of not as extreme or not as noticeable. But there are often things about mistaking certain vices for things like affection or loyalty or just... Anyway, in the bad boys, what you see a lot of is that they have certain vices, like generally imprudence. They take risks that usually they're not super big risks. They're small risks, but they're bigger risks than make any sense to take. They're bad bets, essentially. And like whether it's being overly aggressive, but like most of the time, even if you're a little overly aggressive, people aren't looking for a fight, so they'll back down. So you're not going to get into a fight for no good reason. In the Taylor Swift video, by the way, there's a really fascinating scene where the guy goes, and they're two bikers, Taylor Swift and this, anonymous boyfriend, bad boy character, go into this bar, and they're two bikers, fairly big guys, who are playing pool with each other. And the boyfriend character, who's trouble, goes and he just screws up their game for no good reason. Just messes a ball up. And he picked badly. Because these are biker types, and so they're overly aggressive too, and they're not going to back down. So they just beat the shit out of him in the music video. It's really fascinating, and it's a really good example of how this kind of thing looks like courage until it's just obviously imprudence, because there is absolutely nothing to be gained by this. So the bad boy who, is willing to take these risks, often for at least some amount of gain, even if disproportional. So he's being imprudent, but it looks like he's being courageous. He's willing to take risks for, some benefit. But the fact that it's imprudence eventually catches up. He just makes a really bad decision. There's no benefit to screwing up their game for no reason. And he picked the wrong people to do it with, so they beat the hell out of him because they're a lot bigger and a lot stronger than he is. Because also, hey, not on my microphone. Because, he's like 18 and they're like 28 or 34 or something. And in males, like, you don't hit full... Exceptions aside, you don't hit full strength until really, assuming you're reasonably athletic, until you're in your late 20s, if not your 30s. So some guys in their like late 20s or early 30s are... going to be pretty easily able to beat the hell out of a scrawny guy in his late teens or very early 20s. They're bigger, they've got more muscle, they've got more mass behind their punches, even if a bunch of that mass is fat rather than muscle. They're going to hit a hell of a lot harder just because they're so much bigger. And then there are two of them on top of that. So, and they had pool cues too, although I forget whether they used them in the video. But the point, and this is all germane to the topic, is that this was an imprudent calculation on his part. But the thing is, he wasn't courageous, he was just imprudent. He just liked taking risks. He enjoyed the thrill of doing things that really should go badly, but so far worked out, even though they shouldn't. And there's a special kind of thrill to that. Like when you do something that should have hurt you or do something that should have gone wrong and it doesn't. That can be almost an addictive thrill to like, wow, I got away with that. Maybe people are wrong. Maybe this isn't so bad. Or just like, maybe I'm especially lucky. Maybe I'm, in some sense, not precisely blessed, but the opposite of cursed. Maybe my enemies are cursed in some sense. And so that kind of attitude, that's a bad boy. That's somebody who looks like they're virtuous. That's somebody who, until it goes wrong, looks like they're actually good at appraising situations, like they have a certain amount of wisdom, that they understand how things really work better than the people around them. And it turns out, no, they're just lucky up till now. Things had been going well. They had a string of, unlikely successes. And as long as they're pushing it relatively mildly rather than pushing their luck really hard, they can keep that up for quite some time and seem far more attractive because they are doing what looks to a naive eye like proving that they in fact have the moral virtues that no one around them of their same age group is proving that they have yet. Now, this phenomenon does not really exist. Like, you do not find 30-year-old bad boys. Among 30-year-old men have been working for a while. They have the things to show that they have prudence and temperance and a reasonable amount of fortitude. Maybe not so much courage, but physical courage isn't all that necessary in the modern world for the most part. Not like it used to be. Like, it used to be that anyone without physical courage would probably die. Like back in the days when there were, significantly sized predators around, so that like walking from one place to another was dangerous. But in the modern world, where for the most part we've gotten rid of all the large predators and, our cars have seat belts and, on and on and on, you don't need to be all that physically courageous to do pretty well in the modern world. Occasionally the modern world breaks down and you have to be a lot more physically courageous. But, we're also well fed that, usually you can avoid starvation until things get back to normal. So, but men in their 30s, for the most part, you can fairly well tell who actually has fortitude and courage and temperance. Some at least modicum of wisdom and so on, because they've been doing for a while the sorts of things that actually genuinely require those things. And so you don't tend to have the bad boys, the guys who everyone, because what makes the bad boy, is that, like, to the young woman, she looks virtuous. Everyone around her is saying, like, no, this guy's awful. And so she's attracted to him because he seems to be virtuous, even though the people around her are telling her that he isn't. And so her appraisal of him is different than everyone else, and she thinks she knows better, and then eventually finds out that she doesn't, and, feels a bit of a fool or whatever, to the degree that she has the ability to admit her own mistakes. Varies with the individual. So that's what's going on. You don't see this much in older people for the simple reason that by then, ordinary men are demonstrating their moral virtues in practical ways because they'll have done things like hold down jobs. And when you hold down a job, you just have to have a certain amount of fortitude, and you have to have a certain amount of wisdom and the ability to do things, and so on and so on. So that's why the bad boy phenomenon sort of is what it is. It is difficult to tell whether people have moral virtues in a way it is not difficult to tell whether they have physical virtues. And when you don't know much about human beings, there are various things that look like moral virtues but aren't if you don't know what's going on and don't have a good sense of the situation. That, imprudence or foolhardiness can look like courage, for example, or, merely self-destructive behavior can look like fortitude, like the fact that you're willing to endure pain can look like, you have a certain amount of fortitude, piercings and things like that. Kind of can give that appearance that, like, a person with a whole bunch of piercings, well, like, they hurt to get, so, tattoos can be like that as well. Like, these things hurt to get, so obviously the person who has them must be courageous. Yeah, maybe. Or maybe they just, had something that made the pain worth enduring at the time that was a big enough inducement to them. But when it comes to other things where they don't have the same sort of, promised reward, they're not willing to endure pain because it might benefit somebody else. They're only willing to endure pain because it might benefit them. And the things that, get used amongst, young people as these proxies for the willingness to endure pain for the sake of somebody else, you got hurt, but the child, needs something even though it hurts you to pick them up or whatever. Like that kind of thing. Well, that's different than being willing to endure getting a tattoo for the sake of having this really awesome tattoo that will impress people around you. Like, just helping somebody who needs it with no benefit to you is just a different kind of thing. It's a different kind of virtue and not demonstrated by the other one. But if you don't know much about people, you might suspect, like, oh, well, the 8 piercings in the person's face suggest that they have a high pain tolerance, and so when it comes to doing things for other people, they'll have no trouble stepping up and doing what's necessary. Not impossible. Absolutely no reason why it would be the case, though. And, if you're young and don't know much about people, and especially don't know much about the opposite sex, it's a kind of easy mistake to make. And the people around you who do, and remember, teenagers are famous for their not being very willing to take the word of other people, but needing to find things out for themselves. Well, the people around you telling them, no, this is not a good person. This is not a demonstration of moral virtue. This is a demonstration of just, certain vices. Well, the thing is, when your only other options are all people you have no way of telling whether or not they're any good, it's awfully tempting to go with a person where, like, at least you have some kind of guess. So that essentially is, I believe, in a lot of cases, the majority, I think, of the whole bad boy phenomenon. It's a phenomenon amongst fairly young people who, due to the way modern society is organized, don't have a good way of assessing moral virtues. And so they are prone to the mistake of mistaking certain kinds of vices for certain other moral virtues that they can't really see in other people because society isn't set up in such a way that other people, other men demonstrate those moral virtues. Now, I mean, it is, by the way, I should note, a vice to be unwilling to take the word of people who know more about life than you do. That is to say, people who are wiser than you are. Like, when you don't know much about the world, you really, really, really should find people who are wiser than you and trust them. Your life will go a heck of a lot better if you do. Deciding that, like, it doesn't matter what people who know more than you think, you know best on the basis of, well, you can't fill that part in. That is itself a vice. I'm not trying to say that, like, the women who like bad boys are completely, they're nothing but innocent victims who have absolutely no part. They did everything perfectly. I'm not trying to claim anything silly like that. But I'm trying to sort of explain the phenomenon. Why does this happen? And the short version is that it's actually surprisingly hard in the modern world to figure out who is virtuous and morally virtuous. And it can be surprisingly easy to conflate certain vices with certain virtues. So, there we go. And as I said, he just wanted to come out, and I figured, what the heck, I'll let him. But, the thing is, the very things that can make some people bad can make other people very good. And so, in this case, the thing I had in mind primarily is courage can make people very good, just as things like intelligence and being active can make snakes very interesting. It's just, like all things, they need to be shaped well in order to be good. And moral virtues, being about the complex arrangement of complex beings, are the hardest things in the world really to understand. Now, this is the part where snake analogy breaks down because, they're animals. They're not rational human beings. And so, they're not really moral agents in the same way we are. But yeah, there still is a profitable analogy there. So that, I think, is the phenomenon of bad boys. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at. If you like this video, then clicking the like button, according to YouTube, will make them more likely to recommend it to others. If you know anyone who might get something out of this video, then it would be kind to share it with them, or just share it on social media in general. And if you'd like to see future videos of mine, you can subscribe. And if you're not in the habit of checking your subscriptions page regularly, then I suggest clicking the notification bell and setting that to always, because otherwise subscribing to a channel basically just sort of like gives YouTube a hint that maybe it should consider recommending these videos to you, possibly at some point, if they think so. It's a funny world we live in. God bless.